Hello, Trance. About 217 years ago, I went out for a drink with a friend of mine. We'll call him Brian. And Brian was the designated driver for the evening. And on the way home, Brian handed me a CD. And on the CD was written Ministry of Sound Sampler. So CDs, by the way, that's how we used to listen to music. We put the CD in his stereo in his car. And on this CD was Energy 52, Cafe Del Mar, Games Master by Lost Tribe, Armin van Buuren, Blue Fear, and Tilt, Invisible. Now, I think it's fair to say that the phrase "my mind was blown" is overused a lot these days. But back then, 1996, I think this was, my mind was literally blown. This was, for me, probably the genesis of my complete obsession with dance music and specifically trance music. So let's talk about that now. How did this happen? Where did it begin? And where are we now? So it's fair to say that these weren't the first trance tracks ever created, but at the time, this was an evolutionary process. Now, I think the real beginnings of trance music, dance music had existed for a decade or more. In what we understand now, use electronic-based dance music. It really started with disco in the 70s. Two tracks in particular. What I might do is I'll list some tracks that you might want to listen to if you haven't already heard them. So, Donna Summer, I Feel Love. And even before that, there was a track, Space Magic Fly. Have a listen to that. Incredibly cheesy, but I think it was like 1977, something like this. Years and years ago, but you can hear the beginnings of synthesized 16th bass lines and 4-on-the-floor kick drums. So both those tracks had planted some seeds which would grow over the next few years. But what commonly touted as the first trance track is KLF, What Time Is Love. I'm not buying that. But there's also another track, Age of Love by Age of Love, specifically the Jam and Spoon remix, which is definitely more towards what we understand as trance today. But also have a listen to that KLF track. I think people are getting confused just because there is a Supersource style sound in it that it's trance, but I'm not buying it. I think it's more, if you want to put a label on it, it's more techno than anything else. But when those tracks were released, this period between the late 80s and the early 90s saw a massive explosion in dance music in general. Mostly because of the availability of new kinds of equipment at home, new kinds of digital equipment that made creating this kind of music a lot easier. So we will have a look at that equipment now. Now, really, I think to get an understanding of what had changed in this period, between 88 and 92, just to pick some numbers out of the sky, we have to consider what people were using at home before. Now, in the mid to late 80s, I had a couple of synthesizers at home, but my only option really for sequencing them was either using sequencers on board, which a lot of gear did have, or to buy an external hardware sequencer. And as accomplished as some of these things were, they were incredibly fiddly to use. And the idea that you could edit and change things in this hardware was quite time consuming. You could do it, but it was very time consuming. And due to the nature of their interfaces, they weren't particularly fun to use. But what happened was towards the end of the 80s, Atari released a computer called the ST. And however it got through the accounts department, this thing had a MIDI interface built in, and a bloody good one too. Very tight MIDI timing. So this started to see this explosion of using computers to make music, and specifically a piece of software which I owned called Pro 24. And we're starting to see the beginnings, the very small beginnings of the DAW interface here. So people are able to more easily sequence complicated things with their computer. But on top of that, another company called Alesis released something called the ADAT in 92, early 90s anyway. Now, previous to this, we were all forced to use cassette-based multi-track, either 4 or 8-track recorders. And whilst they were useful for making demos, they were pretty terrible in terms of quality. Whatever you did, however you did it, however much you knew what you were doing, the quality of multi-track cassette recorders is not particularly great. And you're limited to 4 or 8 tracks. You can bounce down, you can start recording 4 tracks onto one, but then the quality degrades more and more and more. But with the Alesis ADAT, it was actually giving you 8 channels of pure digital fantasticness on a video cassette. So you could actually link these devices together, and they're only $3,000 or $4,000. I say only, but that was very accessible at the time. So people were starting to build their DAW setups at home. You can have an Atari ST and an ADAT and have quite pristine recording at home. You'd need a mixing desk as well, but that's another thing that people, more often than not, they had them anyway. And what the ADAT also allowed you to do was, let's say, for example, you were creating a trance track and you had several leads going on. You could actually mix those leads, bounce them down onto 2 of the channels on the ADAT, and then give yourself another 6 channels to use. And because you were doing it digitally, it was fine. Obviously, you had to commit to these decisions, but you could make these decisions and keep the quality in the recording. Now, the other thing, of course, was mid-90s, we saw the explosion of the virtual analog synth. Now, there were 3 in particular: Roland JP8000, which was more towards the end of the 90s, JP8000, the Nord lead, the original Nord lead, and the original Axis Virus. And what this gave us was polyphonic unison. Now, you could detune oscillators in the analog world, but to do it polyphonically was quite expensive and still quite limiting. It was very rare that you'd have an analog synth beyond 8 voices. But the virtual analogs were giving us more than that polyphonically. So the combination of computers, digital recording, and polyphonic unison was really what spearheaded this new genre. You couldn't really do it before. Well, you could, but it would be very expensive and certainly not at home. I think a lot of the more experimental music is going to happen at home, because studio time, even then, was still horrendously expensive. To get a good quality studio was massive money. And of course, the last little item that people were buying at home were the original Akai samplers. Now, Yamaha and Roland did samplers as well, but Akai were the daddy, really. And that gave people access to, and what was starting them was sample libraries. There was a company called Zero G. They did a series of sample CDs called Data Files, and I think they did 3 in total. A lot of the copyright on them was a little bit dubious, but if you ever get your hands on these Data File CDs, you will hear the source material for so many dance tunes of the 90s. Oh God, I recognize that. Like entire vocal lines taken off these sample CDs and used in tracks. And I have it on good authority that Armin van Buuren used an Akai S3000 solely. That's all he used to make Blue Fear. So yeah, a lot of this technology was what spearheaded the kind of explosion of trance music. So that's a little bit about the technology. The next thing we want to have a look at, and the final thing, will be the evolution of trance, how it got from where it was to where it is today. So what does all this mean? We had the technology, we had this explosion of dance music. Well, I think for me, there's a couple of obvious sources for the evolution of trance music. In Germany, there's a lot of acts. There's a guy called Sven Vath, I think that's how you pronounce it, was doing a lot of techno, but it was based around the Supersaw sound. And this German techno, and also the UK ambient scene, the UK chill out ambient scene. And this kind of music was using a lot of digital synthesis like the Korg M1, Roland D50 to create these huge, lush soundscapes. Now, it wasn't just the UK. There was an act called Enigma, which some of you might have heard of, very big at the time. And this guy was doing big production, epic, chanting, storyline music. And having gone through the system myself, there's a lot of the influence of this was, I believe, to be the European music education system at the time. So when I was at school, my school education in music was based around classical music. It's not quite the same anymore. A lot of music lessons today are just based on having fun with instruments and learning about the music business to a certain extent, which is fine. But I think having a basis in classical music as well is quite important for trance music back then, because there's one particular term in classical music called ostinato, and this is the idea that you have recurring musical themes or motifs that keep happening and repeating and evolving over time. And this is something that's used a lot in classical music. And if you think about what trance music is, or not so much now, but what trance music was, you have these repeating riffs and these repeating motifs over and over again. The arpeggio, something that forms the backbone of trance, that these musical phrases that you layer on top of each other. A lot of that comes from an education in classical music. Now, that's not to say that you have to have a background in classical music, but I'm just trying to talk about where the influences might have come from. So you combine this German techno and this ambient chill out music with these options with digital music, digital equipment, the ADATs, the Atari STs, and later the PCs, and the polyphonic supersaw synths. And you start to get this trance music starting to form. But I think what ultimately happened to trance music was it really started taking off in the mid-90s when the synths in particular were released. Trance music really started to form itself into what we recognize as trance music today. But it wasn't necessarily about DJ performance. The DJ performance and the consideration of DJ performances probably happened close around the millennium. That's when a structure was kind of locked in: intro, build up, breakdown, drop, outro, that kind of thing. And something else that was incorporated into trance music from classical music was this idea of a journey. So trance music as an experience, something that you closed your eyes and listened to, rather than something you go into a club and let your pills do the work, that kind of thing. I'm not saying one's better than the other. My preference is more with a journey. I think the ultimate expression of this would be have a listen to the Thrill Seekers remix of Sublime. Now, for me, that is the greatest trance track ever made, hands down. It is just perfection. But you can kind of hear that even though he is himself a DJ, he is himself a extremely talented producer of trance music. I feel that track in particular is as much about the journey as anything else. It has the structure and formation of a classical piece of music, things coming in and out, and it makes you feel up and down and up and down. And that's something I think we've lost a little bit these days. I think the ultimate incarnation of that is big room trance, which is really just about the money shot, you know. Big room trance is just about the money shot, not really trance music at all. But I think what I'll do is, having said everything that I've said, I will now compile a list of maybe 5 or 10 tracks. I can't obviously play them for copyright reasons, but I'll list them at the end, 5 or 10 tracks that I think you could listen to that will describe the evolution of trance music over a period of about a decade. Let's say from the mid to late 90s to the mid to late 20s, so 2007, 2008. I don't think trance music has evolved much beyond that point. I can't see much evolution myself in the last 10 years, but a lot of genres get like that. Psytrance, again, in particular, really has it changed in the last decade? I don't think so. The only thing that's changed is production values keep increasing. They keep getting better and better on one level. So I've waffled on enough. Now I have vomited out all these words. I'll put a list somewhere of these trance tracks. Have a look at those, have a listen to them. And then over the next 9 videos or so, I shall talk more about how I believe that you can put a trance track together. So I'll see you then. Thank you. So we're going to start off with a little look at the intro of a trance track. So the intros themselves these days are kind of little more than a section of audio for a DJ to mix one track into another. So what we're going to have a look at is a couple of ways you might want to spice things up a little bit so that at least that part has some kind of identity of its own as well. Okay, so generally speaking, it's very common to have some kind of percussive loop going on, which I've represented here with a percussive loop. And also, it's very common to have the kick drum filtered up a little bit. So I just put auto filter on this kick drum. That's with the kick off. That's with the kick on. So when you play those two things together, so it's very common for a track to start like that. And then perhaps also we will have, I've got a little noise here from UFX3 by Sonic Academy. You know, it's effective, but it's also a little bit boring, should I say? So we might want to spice things up a little bit. And one of the first things that comes to mind for me is that you might want to have a sound or something that's going on that's a little bit unique to just your track. So for example, I've gone through UFX3 and I found this sound here in the Spot Effects subfolder. And originally it was this pitch here, which is probably, I think, C it was. No, yeah, probably C. My track's in A, not that it matters. So I've just pitched it down 3 semitones. Let me turn this up a little bit. So that's actually now in the key of the track I'm in. We'll have a look at the basses and that a bit later on. But I know my track's in A, so it makes sense to have that particular sound playing in A as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is add this kind of unique, it's almost like a horn, one of those cinematic horns. We could do it up 9 semitones instead. No, I prefer it low. And I'll probably also do something like, oh, it's already on Black Hole. That's handy. Put Black Hole on it. Not that I'm addicted to Black Hole. Not yet. Or anything. And then Elevotal. So we've immediately, as soon as the track starts, we've got something going on that's unique to this track. I mean, there's not many tracks that are going to have that particular sound in them. But the sound you use could be anything. I'm sure you've got like gigabytes and gigabytes of effects sample packs on your hard drive. So go through them and find something interesting that you can have going on in the background. It doesn't have to be a particularly forward sound. But, you know, if you're in a big club and you hear that, the moment you hear that, you're going to go, oh, fuck, that's the sound. That's the track I like. But wait, there's more. So we're going to have a look at this sweep as well. This is a fairly standard noise sweep. And what I've done is I've added a little rack of effects here. We'll have a look at them one at a time. Replica XT, one of my all-time favorites, and Black Hole, probably my all-time favorite. So we'll turn them on one at a time. So Phase Mistress is basically a phaser with added modulation. So it's doing that kind of thing to the noise. So instead of it sounding like a standard sweep, which is good in its own right, but we want to do a little bit more. I'm going to mix in some of this phase preset. So we've got that, which is always good for trance. And then Replica XT over the top. I've quite a high mix on this, and I've got the feedback quite high. Again, I just went through a load of presets. I'm a massive fan of just preset whoring. So that really does lengthen out the tail as well. So Replica XT is kind of a cross between a delay and a reverb. It can sound like both. So we're trying to smooth this noise sweep out and add some extra texture and movement to it. And then I put Black Hole on as well for good effect. Okay, so that extends the tail even further. Black Hole's great for massive atmospheric reverb. I've spoken about this before, but reverb can either simulate a space or it can just be an atmosphere. I tend to prefer for trance, you really are looking at the big, massive atmospheric spaces. That's what we tend to use more than anything else. And then the last thing I've done is put LFO Tool on. However, what I have done is automated in the LFO depth. So this LFO, this volume LFO, as the noise sample initially hits, LFO Tool isn't doing anything because this depth is right down to 0. Back here it is. See, the depth is right down to 0. But as the sound progresses and as the tail kind of smooshes out into reverb and delay, I'm increasing the effectiveness of LFO Tool. So it only starts ducking as the tail fades out. Then I've got it automated to switch off again. So if I want to duplicate this sweep, I can duplicate the automation without it jumping up or down. So instead of this, which is fine, we've got this. So we've got some movement, we've got some big stereo space. It's just a little bit more interesting. Is that LFO Tool? Yeah, that's still on. So there's a couple of things we've done. Let me just get this noise back and turn the automation off. So we've got those two things laid on top of each other. And the final thing I want to take a look at is this loop. So the loop in itself is fine. So when I'm making trance tracks, I'll probably only use 1 or 2 loops. I tend to use them more as filler than anything else, just to add a little bit more texture to the background. Generally speaking, shakers, hi-hats, claps, that kind of thing, I'll always do manually. But loops are brilliant for filling spaces out, and especially for intros as well. So I've got this loop going on, but it's not massively interesting. So one plugin I always go to for trance is Tantra. So I've had a look through quite a lot of the presets, and I've discovered this one called Pad Smoother works particularly well with this loop. And I'm using the dry wet knob to bring the effect of Tantra. And in fact, let me just turn it all the way up for now so you can hear what it's doing. So that's Tantra off. Tantra is fantastic for kind of sequenced filtering, distortion, delay, flanger, the glitch effects. There was that plugin that became really ubiquitous about a decade ago, D-Blue Glitch. Remember that? It was free at the time. It was used on everything. But this is a kind of evolution of that. It does similar things, but all of the effects in this sound really good. That's what makes this the one to go for, in my opinion. But what I want to do is I don't want to have it 100% wet. I want to introduce it into the mix until I find what I perceive as being the sweet spot. That's too much. So we don't need a lot of this, but as I introduce some of the wet signal, just try and perceive what it's doing to the stereo field as much as anything. It's adding a little bit of filtering, but the width this gives is fantastic. Free width. I'm not sitting in a sweet spot to hear this properly. Yeah, I'm hearing that about there. Then, of course, as the intro progresses, we could do something like, we could automate this parameter just to increase the wet a little bit. So we've got an 8-bar section there. So we could probably automate that over 16 bars so that when we go into the main start of the track, we're automating this tantra effect up a bit. Let's just listen to it as it is over 8 bars. Not soloed. Yeah, I mean, that's doing something. There's not enough in there at the moment for it to be working against anything. But for example, we might do that again. And this time, what am I looking for? Reverse. So we can reverse this version. So we'll have the initial hit and then it will reverse into the next section. Let's listen to that. Back to the start, please. Yeah. Yeah, because that's going to introduce the next 8-bar section then. So what I'm trying to say is there's a few elements that you can have in your intro, but try and do something with them that's a little bit different. So each time you add a little bit of variety or variation onto one of these channels, it starts building up into this intro being your intro, your identity. So you might find, for example, after this 8-bar section, you might introduce the open hi-hats. Standard. But have a look through. I mean, like I said, you're going to have gigabytes and gigabytes of random effect samples. Find something that fits in your track and then have a look through all your effects. What are good are things like phasers, tantra, these glitch effects, gates. You can automate reverb. You can use, what else would be a good one? Both phasers and flangers, actually. You can automate in delay in and out, for example, delay feedback, especially. So there's lots of things you can do to make your intro stand out. So I hope you found this video useful, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
Thanks everyone for watching. We really appreciate the support from you guys. If you liked this video, then smash that like button. And if you want to be notified about new content, hit the subscribe and the bell notifications. Peace!